Good morning, everyone. How are you today on this rainy St. Patrick's Day? Woo-woo. Thank you. And we are now at our third lecture, and Neale is going to be speaking today about Rome and Roman art and artifacts and all of that wonderful stuff there. I just wanted to give a little announcement that our first court shows, we're going to be doing a series of court shows throughout the year, which means your neighborhood, so Cedar Court or Alpha Cottages. And today, the art show, we are having an opening for Alpha Cottages and Cedar Court. And we'll have refreshments, and the artists will be there from about 2 until 4 this afternoon up in the Gallery Creative Arts area if you would like to come and visit and sort of support our artists. They have work that they have done from any time since they were in their 20s till present work. And it's a very nice show. I think you all will really enjoy it. But anyway, we'll get back to Mr. Neale Murray, who is going to be giving us a lecture today on Roman art and architecture. And enjoy. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. Appreciate it. Okay, welcome.
Good morning. You perhaps will notice my voice is no better this week than it was last week. But if it's any comfort to you, it doesn't hurt me. It probably hurts you more to listen to it. My throat is not sore. It doesn't work the way it used to. Last week we talked about Greek art, and a major part of Greek art was architecture. And so I want to give you a couple concepts that'll help you understand the relationship between Greek art and Greek architecture and Roman architecture. There are two terms. The first one is innovative. That means new. Whenever new materials come along, whenever new needs come along, you get new-looking architecture, innovative architecture. So, with elevators, with steel, with sheet glass, you end up with modern skyscrapers that couldn't happen before the 20th century. That's innovative architecture. Eclectic architecture is architecture that copies the past. I'll use the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. That's eclectic. It obviously copies Greek and Roman architecture because it relates to a need. Those societies actually had senates, and they needed buildings where the government could meet. Now remember last time when we looked at Greek architecture, I said that they didn't say sculpture and architecture. They had a body image of architecture. Doric is masculine, Ionic is feminine, as is Corinthian. Well, they were locked into that identity so much that they never could move beyond it. The Romans, with their practical way of thinking, took the Greek elements and sort of almost reinvented them, reorganized them. So Roman architecture is eclectic, but it's the most innovative, eclectic architecture you're ever going to see. They didn't just copy, they reused, they reinvented the Greek approach. Now, can we see the first slide, Jenna? This is a Roman temple, and it's in Rome, and it obviously borrows from the cultures around it. The shape of the temple is like an Etruscan temple. It has a cella that expands out, but it has columns, it has a pediment like a Greek temple would have. So it's Greek and Etruscan at the same time. It's marble, so it's basically done. The columns are basically done in the Ionic order. And you notice that corner column, how it has, excuse me, two faces to it. That illustrates the problem of the Ionic order. But notice it has a front porch. And it swells the cella out so much that they have to engage the columns in the cella wall. Well, the Greeks never did that. That's a Roman idea. It looks like Greek, but it's not Greek at all. It's a Roman need. They wanted a big open, because they worshiped inside, not outside. Now can we see the next one, please?
I got a question.
Yes.
I noticed that the stairway, the steps leading up are not enforced. Was that intentional or was that a mistake in terms of structure? It doesn't look like it is very substantial. And I was wondering if that was normal or just a mistake.
No, that's a pretty much normal entrance. And by the way, that's probably concrete. We're going to talk about concrete in a slide or two. Can we have the next one? Pontegard. Remember the hallmark characteristic of the Romans was realism, practicality. That's what they cared about. If they could make a beautiful solution to a practical problem, they'd do it. But they cared more about fixing the problem than the look of the thing. The Pont du Gard is a bridge over the river Nîmes in leads Pont du Gard River that's by the city of Nîmes. So it's a bridge and an aqueduct. Takes water down from the mountains to the city of Nîmes. Now Nîmes, of course, is in France. That tells us something else about the Romans. They created an empire, unlike the Greeks. They were politically much, much more practical than the Greeks. They figured out ways to unite all of these cities that they conquered. And there are two basic rules that they used in that process. Number one, don't mess with the people's religion. Impose your religion on them. Rule number 2, make their letter, not worse. So with that, cities were actually happy to be conquered by the Romans because they got fresh water and all kinds of things that they wouldn't have had by themselves. And the Romans created an army to keep order in this thing, but it didn't have to be that giant because satellite cities weren't about to rebel. They were grateful to be a part of Roman rule. In modern terms, in modern architecture, we have a term that's used. It's called function is beauty. If you meet a need well, if you meet a function well, you will also create an efficient, beautiful structure. And that's pretty much what you see here. The Romans met 2 basic needs in one structure, but in doing it, they created a new system of building. The Greeks knew about arches, but they didn't use them. They didn't need to use them because they didn't have to cover big spaces. The Romans wanted an efficient way to house enclosed big spaces or cross big, and the arch works. And in this case, what we have is an arcade. That's one arch next to another. And because they're equal in size, their downward forces counteract each other and create balance. In a while, I'm going to show you what you need when you get to an end of an arcade, when you've run out of arches. But here you basically have one arch over the other. It's all in fitted stone. There's no concrete here. This is all stone that's fitted together and lasted all these many generations. Can we see the next one, please? Okay, that's a building that's obviously familiar. It's called the Colosseum because it was next to a giant colossus of the colossal statue of the Emperor Nero. And of course, it meets an important public need. What do you do to entertain all the masses in Rome? You create a Colosseum. You create a structure where you can entertain them. It holds about 55,000 people, by the way.
Is that how the theater in the round came about for that theory?
Well, see, the Greeks used hillsides to create hillside places for their theater. But they didn't create enclosed structures like this. Theater in the round is just theater in a round seating area. It obviously borrows from these kinds of structures. Again, look at the aerial view, the bottom view there. It had a false floor because they needed traffic patterns to to get the axe in and out of there. And so again, they come up with these practical solutions. Notice what happens when you get to the end of an arcade. You have to take that final stress downward in a diagonal pattern. The Romans were brilliant engineers. They were innovative engineers. But if you look carefully at the building, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, borrowed Greek idea. The Doric is muscular and strong, so it should be the bottom. Then you move up to the lighter stories. They become feminine and Ionic. Next one, please. Now this is an ancient building by the Romans. It survived because in the medieval era it became a church. But it's a Roman temple. The name helps you understand it. Pantheon means the house of many gods. Each of the planets was associated with a god. So this is a temple for the 7 planetary gods. I don't want to recite them all, but Mercury, Mars, Venus, etc. There was a niche around the temple. Each god had a statue in their niche. Now you're looking at a Christian altar. Now the building is exactly symmetrical. 140 feet this way, 140 feet this way. At the top, you'll notice there are no windows. The top has a large opening, 27 feet across. It's open. It's called an oculus. That lets in all the light It had a bronze shutter in Roman times, so you could close if you needed to.
The columns expanded a little bit in the middle of the golden, the Greeks. You know, they had...
The entasis? No, the columns don't have entasis. Generally, the Romans worked off the Ionic and Corinthian. Look at the porch there, the entranceway. See, that's in an Ionic style. So it's a straight column.
You know, the Greeks had a little expansion in the middle because they thought it was...
Oh, you mean, yeah, because this is round, they didn't modify that layer like that. Now, look at the ceiling. The ceiling tells you something about that building. That building is not made out of marble. That building is made out of concrete. The bottom walls, to support the weight above, are 20 feet thick. 20 feet. The whole building is made out of concrete. That's a new material. The Romans invented a way of slow curing concrete. When you make a giant building like this out of concrete, you have to be able to continuously pour the concrete. So it has to cure slow. It can't harden up right away. If it hardens up right away, you end up with a stratified layers that don't hold together. The whole building has got to be one continuous piece of structure. It's poured concrete to dress it up, the concrete with marble. The floor you see is the original floor. By the way, to answer Ed's question, the floor is in fact a little bit domed because rainwater has to be able to run away from the center because of the oculus when it's open. But anyway, it's dressed up with marble. So it looks Greek, but the Greeks built with solid marble because they never built buildings this big. All of a sudden, this cell houses not one god, but 7 gods. And the populace needs to be able to come inside. But it also tells something else about the Romans. Those squares in the ceiling are called coffers. And in original Roman times, each coffer had a bronze star in it that was gilded. So the ceiling was like the cosmos. The whole idea of the crystal dome of heaven that borrows from Hebrew cosmology. Got the 7 planetary gods around there. So you walk in this thing and imagine it in its original form. It's just you get a sense of awe. But where's the focus? The focus is the oculus. The Romans inherited Greek religion, but they didn't really bring much conviction to it. And this temple sort of represents that. It's really more a temple to the universe rather than a specific god or goddess. By the way, again, their engineering is so amazing. They invented the coffers so the ceiling wouldn't be too heavy. It would have the strength of the thicker portion, but the lightness of the hollowed out section. So it's a beautiful form, but it's also an engineering solution. And also, the concrete is much thinner at the oculus, but by the time it gets down to the circular wall, it's about 17, 18 feet thick. Can we see the next one, please? This is a palace of Diocletian in Croatia. And it shows us how inventive the Romans could be with these Greek orders. For instance, look at the end of this. You see a pediment there, but the Greeks never broke their pediments. The Romans put an arch in the middle of the pediment. to frame the doorway. Also, the Greeks would never think of putting an arch on a column. Occasionally, they used arches, but they would use them only on a solid wall. Here you have arcade of columns. So it's amazing inventive structure using all these Greek parts, but really being Roman in character. By the way, Diocletian was one of the last important Roman emperors. He was the guy, the Roman Empire. So you have an Eastern Empire and a Western. The Western was in Istanbul, Constantinople. The Eastern, or the Western, stayed in Rome. He could see the West was getting into trouble. In order to save the empire, he split it and moved part of it easterly. A lot of people think the Roman Empire ended up in the 400s. It didn't. It ended up in the Italian Renaissance in the 1450s. The Eastern was still functioning in the middle of the Italian Renaissance. The West, of course, had fallen apart by then, long before then. The other thing to know about Diocletian, he was the last persecuting emperor. The last martyrdoms of early Christians were under Diocletian. And the way those martyrdoms worked, in Roman cities, you had a statue of the emperor, and you were to give allegiance to that statue, just like Americans give allegiance to the flag. It was your role as a citizen to venerate that statue. The Christians wouldn't do that. That's how they found out who was Christian. And the way they got Christians to recant under punishment of death was to pay allegiance to the statue. If you did, you were off. If you didn't, it's to the Colosseum and the lions.
Is this concrete or marble?
This is marble facing, but it's probably a concrete superstructure. Look behind the pediment back there. That's probably brick. Materials all over the time like that. Can we see the next one, please? This is bronze. It's called the orator. It represents some sort of leader speaking to an audience. That's why his arm is out like that. It's in bronze, so it's remained intact. But you notice it looks like a marble photograph. It has none of the grace of the Greek statues. In fact, you notice he's wearing boots. He even has shoelaces in the boots that are tied. It's just the Romans wanted to look real. They had almost no aesthetic sense at all about sculpture. But this represents the kind of figures that would be in city squares. Notice its height. They would normally be heroic in scale, slightly larger than life size, but life size enough that you had to think about the emperor. Now, one of the things that was part of this process that I was talking about, the way you venerated the statue was to say, Caesar is Lord. Now, if you've read your New Testament carefully, of Paul, he repeats that, except he changes it. Jesus is Lord. That was the difference between understanding of meaning in life. The Roman meaning was civic. The meaning of your life is related to that imperial structure. The Christian vision was the meaning of life is related to that sacrificial figure. Now, can we see the next one, please? Augustus was one of the most famous and most important of the early Roman emperors. This is a statue of him. It was originally painted, and that's why you see the one up, the upper left, have some color to it. The one below is the existent one. You see how it copies Greek sculpture. It's in marble, but it copies Greek sculpture. Notice the pose. It's a contrapposto Greek pose, and it's an idealized figure. It represents a likeness of Augustus, but in a more handsome format. This would be the kind of statue you would be asked to venerate. Now remember, this guy he's actually the nephew of Julius Caesar. And he's one of the most important of the early Roman emperors. He's one of what we call the good emperors. As time went on, the imperial process started to disintegrate. And I want to show you an example of some of that disintegration. Can we see the next one?
Can you explain the infant? Can you explain the infant by his leg?
Yeah, that's Cupid. And at this point in time, the imperial emperors were thought to be godlike. And so Augustus is the son of Venus. And Cupid, of course, is also Venus's son. So that's the whole, it associates him with that deity cult. That's why it's there like that. Can we see the next one, please? Here's a good example of how that imperial process disintegrated. This is a statue of a much later Roman emperor. It demonstrates how far we've gotten away from that Greek sense of beauty. The figure is in a Greek pose, but the proportions are all wrong. The head is way too small for this huge body, and they give us that nude figure, but he still somehow has got to wear shoes. He can't just be totally nude. It's just a clumsy looking figure. By the way, first time I saw this, by the way, this thing is in the Met in New York. And it's really tall. It's 10 to 12 feet tall. First time I saw it, the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. And that's Lyndon without his clothes on. Remember how he showed his scar, his operation? Now, just the scale tells us something. No longer could you rule by just general belief. You had to overpower people. You have to overwhelm them with your authority. That's why this thing is so big. And these things keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger as we move along. Can we see the next one, please? This is another Roman ruler, Philippus the Arab. And you can see how the Romans love portraiture. They like things accurate. So when they make a portrait, it tends to be realistic. It's not idealized. And look at this guy's face and expression. This is not the kind of guy I want to meet in a dark alley at night. Things are unraveling in the West. And Philippus, of course, was a Western ruler, although he came from the East. He's called the Arab. This is, by now, the only way you become an emperor is not by succession, but by military might. Can we see the next one, please? Now we're looking at really the end of the Roman Empire in the West. Tetrarchs were regional rulers of the Western Empire. Now, by the way, those of you who've been to Venice, this statue in a purple stone we call porphyry is actually in the corner, built in the corner, front corner of the facade of St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. But these are rulers. Look at the height. It's no longer huge scale. It's smaller. Partly because that's a very difficult stone to carve, extremely hard. Look at their pose. They have their hands on their swords as if they're ready to defend themselves. And look at their relationship to each other. They're clinging to each other. They don't look commanding anymore. They're fearful. The ironic thing about the Romans is they tend to give us kind of ugly, awkward statuary. But their statuary has an expressive quality to it that the Greeks never had. It has a vulnerability to it that the Greeks. Now, can we see the next one, please? In their pragmatic way of thinking about art, the Romans made public monuments like triumphal arches. And this is a column of Trajan. It's 125 feet high. It's carved out of marble, but it's hollow. It has a stairway up through the middle of it. And it illustrates a military campaign against the Dacians, who are a barbaric tribe. Actually, they were a Celtic tribe. It's Celtic Day today, so I figure we might as well bring the Celts in here somehow or other. Here's a close-up of what it looked like. It's simply a realistic carving of a military campaign. And it's there for a political purpose, to impress people. Now, currently, the statue atop is St. Peter. But in fact, in ancient times, it's called Trajan's column. Guess who was there? Trajan was on top of that column. Now, can we see the next one, please? Folks, look carefully at the measurement there. That's the head of a colossal statue of Constantine. Imagine the height of that thing. The head is supposed to be 1/8 of the figure. His head is 8 feet high. But you notice the thing has a kind of odd look about it. It doesn't look, it's gone back to a kind of idealized look, with one exception. If you can remember, back in the fall, when I showed you Mesopotamian sculpture, I showed you a bunch of statues that were worshipers, and they had giant eyes. The eye is the window to the soul. Constantine, of course, is the first Christian emperor. He actually had some success as an emperor, but after his reign, everything disintegrated again. Now, can I see the next one, please? Last week, after we were over, Jana asked me about Greek painting. She said, why didn't we see any Greek painting? And I told her, there is almost no Greek painting left. The Greeks did paint. The closest thing to their painting is the work we see on their vases. But there's almost nothing left of Greek painting. You'll notice the location of this particular painting, Naples. Naples is on the coast of Italy. It's about 25 miles away from a very important ancient site, Pompeii. This painting was part of one of the Roman villas in Pompeii. And the only Roman paintings we have left are paintings generally from Herculaneum and Pompeii. Roman homes had a very unique character to them. They had an open courtyard as you entered the house called the atrium. And when I say it was open, the ceiling was open. The ceiling slanted inward. And beneath that ceiling was a shallow pool. Rainwater for the use of the house. That atrium was a dining hall, was a courtyard, and around that garden were the bedrooms. Roman rooms were not very big. The bedrooms were little. So in order to make the rooms bigger, look bigger, they painted these vistas that look out into space. Sometimes they painted, and in this case, they painted art. But notice, although buildings are well painted, if you try to make sense out of it, it doesn't make sense. They don't understand linear perspective. It took Brunelleschi in the Italian Renaissance to figure out how architectural space works. But at this time, that's what they had. And they're fresco paintings. Fresco painting is painting on plaster. And can I see the last slide, please? This is from a site we call the Villa of Mysteries in Pompeii. This is a separate private room in the back of this important Roman villa. And what you're looking at is a pictorial representation of a Roman mystery cult. Now remember what I said about Roman religion. It was civic religion. The populace, like all of us, wanted a more personalized religion. So throughout Rome, many mystery cults were brought in from the East that were more personalized. This is a cult of Dionysus, and it's a cult that came from Greece. Now these cults had one or two common. They're called mystery cults. Outsiders didn't understand what their or rights were. To be had to be initiated. Once you're initiated, you're supposed to keep in your own heart and mind. Now it's no accident that the Romans thought faith as just one of the many mysteries. Because why? It has an initiation rite. To most, they worship. It wasn't part of the public religion in private homes, just like the mystery cults did. A weird understandings developed of that private aspect of the faith. And Diocletian bought into some of those rumors. And that was part of the kind of persecution that he was a part of. But I want you to say, this is where we are at the birth of Christianity. The reason I'm finishing here is next week, if I have a voice to actually talk about it, we're going to talk about early Christian art. And I wanted to get you ready for the art we're going to see next week. Now, do we have any questions?
Yeah, I do have a question. Somewhere I've heard where the Lord said you're not allowed to create any graven images.
Yeah?
We're seeing a lot of that in the Roman.
Right, but see, the Romans didn't have any provisions to that. Islam did, and the Jews eventually modified that. So the Jews did, in fact, at least paint realistic figures, as far as we know. Yeah, the Greeks and Romans had no religious prohibitions at all about that.
For the planets like whether worship or not, it's just,
We don't, because it's a mystery cult,
yeah, I guess you don't.
as far as most of the texts say, they think it's some initiation rite into maybe a girl's menstrual period or something, and it's commemorated of initiation rite. That's the only so I can't explain it.
Pompeii had a lot of things.
Yeah.
Were you there? Did you see Pompeii?
I,
Did you go to Pompeii?
Yeah, I've been to Pompeii. And not all of them are for public consumption. There are other, what you've seen works in Pompeii as well. People the Romans buy that. You don't build an empire last hundreds of years on pornography. You build solid family relations. The Romans were family-loving people, at least in their early years. Other questions? Yes?
Neil, you speak of these things with such passion. Have you seen most of them yourself?
Some of them, only maybe half I've seen.
Well,
Well, thank you. Being an artist, I know what goes into making an object. And I try to empathize with what it took to do that. So I reconstruct it in my brain. And that creates not just ideas, but feeling. Yeah.
I have a question with relation to your work. When you cast in bronze, are you sending it to be finished, or you do it here?
Most modern sculptors don't do their own casting. My bronze work, I've done some small casting directly myself, but the bronze panels that are a Wittenberg this high, about this wide, those were cast in a foundry in south of Chicago. Yeah, because it requirement and so much specialized stuff to cast in bronze. It's really almost an industrial process. It's time for us to have lunch, but I'm happy to answer any other questions. Thank you, folks. Thank you for coming.